If I asked you what the most iconic shoe in pop culture history was, what would you say? Would it be Cinderella's glass slipper, Calvin's magic Nike blazers in Like Mike, or Dorothy's red slippers in The Wizard of Oz, or Zendaya's So Kate's? Me personally, I would probably say Kanye's Nike Air Yeezys, specifically the red pair. And if you said these, get out.
You need to leave!
Shoes are not just a functional clothing item, but a cultural phenomenon, denoting status, occupation, and interest. I would take it a step further and say that shoes are spiritual. Hi, my name is Duhhmarkis. I am a TikTok refugee and a longtime YouTube watcher. And since they are getting rid of TikTok,
Yes, I'm telling you, they is for real, they is!
I've decided to bring my content of theology and fashion over to YouTube. I actually studied fashion in undergrad and I went to Parsons for grad school. It was very short-lived. I ended up dropping out. Long story. But before I left, the thesis that I started on was actually regarding sneakers and the effects that it had on inner city youth. Prior to Miley Cyrus and Juicy J's 2013 song 23 ruining what was a pretty niche subculture, there was a lot of ritual around shoes, specifically sneakers. Most millennials will know that back in the day, before the internet, before the sneaker apps, you would have to go to the mall to get your shoes. The sneaker releases were Saturday morning, and you would have to wake up literally at the crack of dawn to wait in line to get your shoes. And sometimes you would have to go to 2 and 3 different malls just to find your size, unless you had a connection or knew somebody that worked in a sneaker store. I was not that lucky, so I was usually on the hunt with my friends, going from Foot Locker to DTLR, looking for whatever Jordans were releasing at the time. After you got your pair of Jordans, it was a very euphoric feeling. Like, you could not wait to go to school on Monday. You already had an outfit picked out. And unlike today's time where nobody really likes to dress the same, it was pretty cool to like show up to school and everybody had on their same style of Jordans but styled them differently. It brought a sense of community and it really made you feel like you were a part of something. It was pretty cool. Even unboxing shoes or breaking them in around the house is somewhat of a ritual. Rituals, ceremonies, and symbolic meanings behind shoes were not new to us millennials. In fact, it was quite biblical. Before we look at shoes and the rituals surrounding them, I think it's important to look at the symbolic nature of our feet in general, because the Bible does talk about them a lot. Feet in the Bible actually represent power and possession. Verses like Psalm chapter 8 verse 6 say, "You made them rulers over the works of your hand. You put everything under their feet." Or Joshua 10 verse 24 says, "When they had brought these kings to Joshua, he summoned all the men of Israel and said to the army commanders who had come with him, 'Come here and put your feet on the necks of these kings.' So they came forward and placed their feet on their necks." Feet also represents territorial claims. Verses like Deuteronomy chapter 1:36 say, "And I will give him and his descendants the land he set his feet on, because he followed the Lord wholeheartedly." Or Joshua chapter 1 verse 3, "I will give you every place where you set your foot, as I promised Moses." If the foot, which we need to stand, walk, work, travel, represents power and possession, we could say that the shoe, which protects the foot from rough terrain and elements, represents God's authority, his covering, and making sure that he takes care of his possessions. This is actually highlighted in Deuteronomy chapter 29 verse 5, which says, "Yet the Lord says, during the 40 years that I led you through the wilderness, your clothes did not wear out, nor did the sandals on your feet." Or Deuteronomy chapter 32 verse 10, which reads, "In a desert land he found him. In a barren and howling waste he shielded him and cared for him. He guarded him as the apple of his eye." Which pretty much supports what was said in chapter 29. Alonzo L. Gaskill of Brigham Young University wrote an article entitled The Ceremony of the Shoe. In this article, he states, in modern as well as ancient cultures, shoes have served not only a practical function, but also an aesthetic one. However, when employed in biblical ritual, shoes have an almost exclusively symbolic purpose. For example, they can represent one's preparation for a task. Sometimes they imply the status of the wearer, like freedom for the souled, and enslavement or poverty for the barefoot individual. In contrast, going barefoot is occasionally utilized as a sign of mourning. Finally, perhaps the most commonly associated means have to do with the removal of shoes when one enters hallowed ground. Thus, we see footwear as more than a convenience and more than an accessory. Shoes, slippers, and sandals are important symbolic articles for ancient and modern Israel and God's covenant people. In the article, he then goes on to talk about the next prominent symbolic use of the shoe as highlighted in the Bible. And this actually is the ritual or the ceremony known as halitza. Halitza is a Jewish word which means removal or the untying. This ritual is actually highlighted in Deuteronomy chapter 25. And it reads, if brothers are living together and one of them dies without a son, his widow must not marry outside of the family. Her husband's brother shall take her and marry her and fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to her. The first son she bears shall carry on the name of the dead brother so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. However, if a man does not want to marry his brother's wife, he shall go to the elders at the town gate and say, my husband's brother refuses to carry on the brother's name in Israel. He will not fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to me. Then the elders of this town shall summon him and talk to him. If he persists in saying, I do not want to marry her, his brother's widow shall go up to him in the presence of the elders, take off one of his sandals, spit in his face, and say, this is what is done to the man who will not build up his brother's family line. That man's line shall be known in Israel as the family of the unsandaled. So, doing this act in front of all of the elders and all of these witnesses was essentially like a legal attestation that you were either giving up your possession or that you were going to, go ahead and fulfill your duty as the redeemer of this bloodline. And the removal of the sandal or slipper at the end of this transaction was essentially signaling the fact that this transaction was complete and that the ritual was legally binding. We actually see an example of this ritual take place in the book of Ruth, chapter 4, verse 7, which reads, now in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel. So the guardian redeemer said to Boaz, buy it yourself, and he removed his sandal. So if you don't know the story of Ruth, Ruth essentially travels back to Bethlehem with her mother-in-law Naomi after her husband, Naomi's husband, and Naomi's other son has all passed away. When they get back to Bethlehem, Ruth begins to work for their kinsman redeemer Boaz, and Naomi suggests that she asks Boaz to redeem their family and basically marry her. Boaz has to then complete this ritual ceremony in order for the transaction to go through legally. There was another kinsman redeemer that was next in line to fulfill that duty for them. This kinsman redeemer actually turned down the offer to redeem Naomi and Ruth because it would have affected his inheritance. He was really only interested in gaining the property, but not necessarily marrying Ruth. So he essentially took off his shoe and passed over his rights to this possession to Boaz, and Boaz then claimed the land and he claimed Ruth to marry. And because we know that feet represent territories, passing over your shoe essentially gave up your right to walk freely or dwell in a particular part of land, and it gave up any possessions that were included with that land. So this actually represents so much metaphorically, symbolically, with our walk with Christ. When we choose to follow Christ, we are metaphorically taking off our shoe and transferring the right of possession to Jesus. We are putting our free wills in the hand of God. Remember that 1 Corinthians chapter 6 verse 20 says that we are bought with a price, which was the blood of Christ. Then verses like 1 Peter chapter 2 verse 9 state that we are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that we may proclaim the excellencies of him who called us out of darkness into his marvelous light. So, in a sense, when we accept Christ and when we choose to follow Christ, we are taking off our shoes and giving it to Christ in this covenant agreement. But there is another connection when it comes to the removal of your shoe and ritual and ceremony. In Gaskell's article, he writes, the removal of shoes upon entering sacred ground symbolizes the temporary divesting of oneself of the world and its ways, exchanging temporal property for spiritual residence. It is a symbolic effort to set aside the natural man and the things of this fallen world in order to consecrate one's life and embrace the things of God, including his presence, glory, and spirit. Thus, one typologist wrote, putting off shoes on entering the holy place represents leaving earthly contact outside and divesting oneself of vice. And we actually see this in the Bible in stories like Moses at the burning bush. In Exodus chapter 3, verse 5, God tells him, do not come closer, take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. And then in Joshua, we see the same thing when Joshua's armies are approaching Jericho before they actually do anything. The commander of the Lord's army replied, take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy. And Joshua did so. This is in Joshua chapter 5, verse 15. Also, I think it's interesting to notice that in Deuteronomy chapter 28, when God is telling Moses how to construct the priestly garments for Aaron and his sons, he does not mention shoes at all. And that is because priests minister to God in the temple, the tabernacle or the temple. It was holy, so they really didn't need shoes, in his presence. And just like Moses took off his shoe before he approached the burning bush and received his instructions from God on how he was supposed to start his ministry and lead the people out of Egypt, we pretty much do the same thing as Christians when we follow Christ. We are, again, we're taking off our shoe and we're in a ritualistic way exhibiting faith in the bridegroom, who is Christ, to save or redeem us, just like Ruth. I also think it's interesting that when you get to the Gospels, people were inquiring of John the Baptist and asking him, hey, are you the Messiah? Are you the Christ? And he would respond to them and say, I baptize you with water, but he who is mightier than I is coming, the strap of whose sandals I'm not worthy to untie. He will baptize you with the Holy Spirit and with fire. And he was essentially alluding to that ritual or ceremony of removing the sandal. He was basically saying, I'm not worthy, I'm not fit to take on this burden or this mantle that Christ is coming to take on. Like, he's the Redeemer. I cannot redeem you in the way that he's coming to do that. And so there's so many things that are alluding to this ritual or the ceremony of giving over your shoe and putting your faith in God and entering in this legal binding contract with Christ. Biblical law actually states that give and it will be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap, for with the measure you use it will be measured back to you, which means what you give, you will get back. And so I find it very interesting that God doesn't just take our metaphorical shoes and leave us barefoot in the world. Remember, to be barefoot in the world actually is to be impoverished, is to be destitute, is to be in mourning. Even in the wilderness, God told the Israelites, even your sandal straps were not unbroke. I took care of you. I made sure that you were covered at all times. And he promises the same to us. In Matthew chapter 7, verse 11, Jesus says, if you then, though you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask? When we choose to follow him, he's gonna make sure that we are taken care of. And this is actually illustrated in the parable of the prodigal son in Luke chapter 15, which reads, "The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet.' So, although we are giving over our sandal and we are giving over the rights to our lives, God still clothes us with power and authority and territory." I think that's so interesting. I don't know if anybody else is connecting these dots, but that gets me excited. In Ephesians chapter 6, we are told to stay equipped with the whole armor of God, which includes the shoes of the gospel of peace. The gospel of peace is a message of Jesus Christ's death and resurrection. It brings peace and salvation to humanity. Wearing the shoes of the gospel of peace prepares Christians to share the good news of the gospel with others, but it also provides a firm foundation that helps Christians keep their footing in difficult times. If you're going through stuff, knowing that Jesus has died for you gives you that peace. It gives you motivation. If you're wrestling with sin, or if you're trying to overcome things, knowing that God has already conquered the grave, Jesus has already conquered the grave at the cross, should give you peace. And you're supposed to wear those. You're supposed to stand firm in that. And that's why we see so many Bible verses like Galatians 5:1 urging us to stand and stand firm in the faith.
Stand up! Stand up!
Before StockX, before GOAT, before all of these sneaker websites and apps, I hated going to the mall because some of my friends had the connections at the sneaker store, so they were guaranteed to get their sneakers. Me being a size 11, size 12 foot at the time, trying to find sneakers, competing with grown men at 16, 17 years old, it stressed me out too bad. And so I wanted to buy sneakers offline. The internet was new. There were sites that were starting to come up. I ordered a pair of Jordan 12s, red and white. And I was so excited wearing them to school one day. I should have known something was funny because both of my brothers looked down at my shoes like, "Oh, okay." Says a lot about them because they did not warn me or tell me not to wear them. I wouldn't have listened anyway, so. I wear these things to school. One of my friends said, "Oh, I ain't never seen those before." But it was the tone. It was the tone. How humiliating. I could have cried. And when I tell you, I threw those shoes away when I got home. Never wore them again. And there was another incident where I was 5th grade. Wanted to have some Timberlands so bad. I wanted Timberlands so bad. They were the shoes that everybody had. I just needed them. My mom was not feeling the idea of buying $130 shoes for a 12-year-old, 10-year-old, however old you are in 5th grade. She got me Skechers boots. Skechers. She didn't even get me lugs. She got me Skechers boots. And when I tell you the dread that came over my face when one of my friends lifted up my pants leg and saw a S instead of a tree. Yeah. That's the same fear when it comes to the Bible. It's just like, do you have a counterfeit gospel? Are you walking around with a counterfeit gospel? Sometimes people have counterfeit gospel, which is why they don't have that peace that is promised to us. The gospel doesn't say that our lives are going to be easy, but it does promise us that when we are going through life, we are going to have peace of mind. The same peace of mind I would have had I just had Timberlands instead of Skechers. Another thing that was so crazy about sneakerheads is like, don't scuff their shoes. When you get some new Forces, you're going to be walking around on the heels of your feet, making sure you don't have creases on them, or at least back in high school. You're going to be wearing your long socks down, making ankle socks and folding your socks up so that you don't get creases in your shoes. That's how serious it was. When we're looking at the metaphor of the spiritual shoes, the gospel of peace, like, how are you making sure that your shoes aren't damaged? If someone or something tries to ruin the peace that you have in God, are you gonna completely just discard the peace that you have and just say, oh, well, these shoes are damaged? Are you just gonna throw them away? Are you gonna lash out at people and fight them because they scuff your shoes? Like, how are you gonna handle that? Like, I really sit back and think about all of the kids who lost their lives over shoes, Jordans in particular. Like, and this is still going on to this very day. Like, hundreds of kids have lost their lives over shoes. And it's just like, when you think about it, think of how many Christians have lost their lives over the gospel of peace. They're trying to share peace. They're trying to walk with authority, and they're losing their lives for it. I think Christians, especially Western Christians, can sometimes take it for granted, the privilege that we have to share the word, the privilege that we have to, just walk in a manner that brings glory and honor to Christ. I think we really do take it for granted, and we don't appreciate it. And speaking of appreciate, imagine you've waited years to get your hands on a pair of Socates, and you put them on and they're uncomfortable. Are you just gonna throw them away? You wanted these shoes for years. They're your dream shoes. You've already heard people say that they hurt. And now that you have them, you're like, oh, this pain is way worse than I thought. But you know that if you just walk around the house for a few hours, you will break them in. The gospel is no different. The gospel is not comfortable. When you start reading that word, it makes you uncomfortable. Sharing the gospel is uncomfortable at first. But the more you do it, the more you walk in it, the easier and the more comfortable it gets. So it's like, you can't just discard of them and throw them away when it can bring you the peace that you are searching for. It can bring you the territory and the power and the possessions that you are searching for if you are doing it with the right heart posture. And another thing that really irritates me with sneakerheads is like, why are you buying shoes and not wearing them? Why put them in a glass case for them to crumble away? And it's the same with the gospel. Like, why, as a Christian, are you taking these shoes and only putting them on for special occasions, Christmas and Easter? Like, you should be carrying these shoes and wearing these shoes daily, because at the end of the day, they are your covering for your feet. And your feet is what God is going to use to bring you power and possession and territory. So you have to keep these shoes on at all times. I kind of have a problem with this myself. Like, I remember a few years ago when those Lanvin sneakers first came out, I wanted them so bad. Wanted them so freaking bad. And it took me the longest time to find them. I actually found them on sale on My Teresa. And I got them and I wore them a few times, and it's like the thrill is gone. And the same thing happened with the Mason Margiela Gats. Like, I wanted these shoes so bad. I got them on Farfetch. There was a whole big thing with the boutique not having them and canceling my order. I fought for those shoes. I got them and I don't even wear them. Especially now that I see Steve Madden has a pair of identical dupes for a fraction of the cost, which irritates me. But I feel like we also do that with the gospel sometimes too, where it's like, once that initial thrill and zeal wears off, we can kind of grow a little bored with it. And we have to constantly remind ourselves of why we are following Christ, why we are serving. I have to remind myself why I wanted these shoes so bad in the first place. I know I'm starting to sound a little crazy with this metaphor, but it just really gets me thinking, like, everything in the Bible is connected, and I hope that when you read the Bible and you start seeing God talk about your feet and start talking about shoes and these things, that these things really start sticking with your mind. The Bible is so interesting and so deep, and I love it. And I plan on making more videos about my love for Christ, theology, the arts, fashion, and the ways that they are connected. And if you want to hear more, please subscribe. And you can follow me on TikTok as well. It's Duhhmarkis, Duhh Marcus. Bye.